Okay, finally, the last continua, which is on the next slide, high context versus low context. Now, this terminology was developed by an anthropologist and cross-cultural researcher named E.T. Hall. And this is actually not a separate continuum as much as it is a way to group all the continuums, the continua that we've already looked at. So, in general, the continua that we've mentioned thus far fall into two categories. So, you have high context and low context. High context cultures tend to be more event-oriented, holistic in their thinking. Everything's connected. That's high context. Status-focused, because you're connected to your family and what family you came out of. Non-crisis oriented. They're not so concerned with insurance and protecting themselves because they know they're in a context where their family systems will help them if a crisis arises. They're person-oriented, so the relationships are valued. Particularist in their rules and standards because relationship is valued. Collectivist, obviously the group is part of that context. And neutral. So all of these ends of the spectrum tend to be high context cultures. And often cultures which are one of those things under high context are also many of the others. For example, the Asian students at Cascade are not only holistic in their thinking and status focused, but you will often find that they're also collectivist, they're also particularist, and many of the things on that side. Low context, on the other hand, is time-oriented, dichotomistic, achievement-focused, crisis-oriented, task-oriented, universalist, individualist, and affective. So there is quite a difference between high context and low context. And this shows us that when you look at students in your classroom, they're not just different on a few pieces of the continua, or a few of the continua, but they're often different in a lot of the continua. So you might have two students who sit in front of you every day, and maybe they're just different in one continua. Well, they can learn how to deal with each other, right? If one is event-oriented and one is time-oriented, maybe they can come to an understanding of each other and a compromise. But if one is event-oriented, holistic, status, person, particularist, and all of those, and the other one is time, dichotomistic, achievement, blah, 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 all of those, then that's a lot of work to get them to understand each other, because on multiple levels, they're approaching things from different viewpoints. So that's something important to to take into account when you're dealing with cross-cultural relationships in your classroom. It's not a simplistic thing. We're talking about complex differences between the cultures. Okay, finally, there's one other way to talk about the cultural differences that I've appreciated. It's also a kind of a summation of cultural differences, sort of like a high context, low context is a summation of these different cultural continua. This is hot climate, cold climate. This is from this book, Foreign to Familiar by Sarah Lanier. And she generally sums up cultural differences according to whether they are hot climate cultures or cold climate cultures. And all cultures in the world she can categorize either as hot cultures or cold cultures. And these are actually according to, by and large, the climate in which the culture exists. So, for example, cultures like Pacific cultures, South American cultures, equatorial cultures that are hotter are generally very different than cultures where the weather is colder. So there's a quote at the bottom of this slide, which I'll just read, that kind of sums it up. "Who knows why the climate should make such a difference? It may be a matter of agrarian versus industrial-based economics. It may have to do with the cold weather, keeping people indoors more, and thus more to themselves and less interdependent on their neighbors. Perhaps in the hot cultures, there is more living off the land, and with it, more interdependence between neighbors, and thus relationships are more important. I have a theory that the world was at one time much more hot climate, and that only with the Industrial Revolution and the artificial imposition of structured time did that change in certain societies. So, cultures that are more industrial, where the weather is colder, there is less need to be interdependent, those are cold cultures. And cultures where it's hot, so you can't stay in your house all day, you need to go out where it's breezy, and agriculture is more important, so you have to be outside in the fields. There's more interdependence between peoples, and these are called hot cultures. So on the next slide, we see some examples. Hot climate or hot cultures are, for example, the southern U.S., as opposed to the northern U.S., which is a cold culture. Asia, Pacific Islands, South America, Africa, Mediterranean countries, the Middle East, and native indigenous peoples. Those are all generally more hot climate cultures, which are generally more high context cultures, similar to the high context category that E.T. Hall brought up. Cold climate cultures, Canada, northern U.S., northern Europe, and Israel, specifically the Jewish population of Israel. Even though Israel is in the Middle East, the Jewish population is largely from European countries, which are cold climate cultures. So this might explain a little bit about why Jews in Israel have such problems with Palestinians, who are their neighbors. Because not only are there all of the historical problems between those people groups, and political problems, but there's also a wide cultural divide. You're talking about hot culture people and cold culture people, and it's no surprise that they're constantly at odds with one another. New Zealand, the white population is generally cold culture. However, the Maoris, the native indigenous population, is more of a hot culture. In Australia, the whites are cold culture and the Aborigines are hot culture. In South Africa, the whites are cold culture, but the black and colored populations are hot culture. So generally, these descriptors show you that the cultures that are more agrarian, whether they're technically hot or cold in weather, are more interdependent, more hot cultures, high context cultures, more focused on relationship, person orientation, all of the things that were under high context, as E.T. Hall described it. Whereas the cold cultures are much more individualistic and less connected with their neighbors. Okay, there is a resource that Cascade has at its disposal that I want you to use for the last assignment for this lesson. Assignment 2E is to do cultural research. And I'm not sure how many of you know about this resource, so I wanted to make sure that you were aware of it. So on this next slide, there's a link, and you will find in your Moodle folder for this lesson. This is all described in a Word document as well. You need to go to the link, which is for Culturegrams, and log in with the username and the password for Cascade, which is both on this PowerPoint and also in the Word document. And I want you to use this website to do some cultural research. Culturegrams is some of the best cultural research and resource around. So it's an excellent website. There are all kinds of things you can get into there. You can learn about history, cultural traditions, cultural gestures, food, everything about a country. So I want you in your assignment to spend 30 minutes researching either China, South Korea, or Japan. And I choose those three countries because they're the countries with the most that most of the international students at Cascade come from. I want you to spend 30 minutes researching, and then choose at least 5 pieces of information that you learned from your research, and tell me a little bit about how knowing that new information would help you to interact with a student from that culture in your classroom. Okay. The other thing that I just want you to know about this resource is, as well as being able to access it online and look at the online pages, which have extensive things including interviews with students from each of the countries. You click on Japan and there's a section where you can find a Japanese student talking about his or her culture, and that's true for every country in the world. You can also print out a version of the cultural research, and this is a really great resource for iTerm. So if you were preparing to take an iTerm group to a country, you could go on Culturegram, find the cultural report, and have your print it out and have your students use it. This is high quality research. Cascade pays for a subscription to be able to access it. I know because I've worked for other organizations that did not have a subscription, and even to download this report you have to pay like $2 per copy to use it. So it's really well done research. It's worth the money. So don't let this resource get away. I want you to make the most of that, especially as you consider other cultures and as you prepare for iTerms where you might be encountering different cultures. Okay, that's it for this lesson, and I'll see you next time.